Now, we talked about managers in the past who come from the Bundesliga, Daniel Farke last week, of course, not the Bundesliga necessarily, but certainly from German football. Hasenhuttl had great success at Leipzig. But Mike, if you read his interviews, one thing he doesn't like to be is compared to Jurgen Klopp. Yes, they did their badges at the same time. Yes, they play a similar sort of high pressing approach, but he just doesn't like being compared because he really wants to be his own man, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's an obvious comparison that people make. And I think that the triumvirate almost of Farke, Klopp and Hasenhuttl, there's lots of similarities between the three different managers. And, you know, background has got a lot to do with it in terms of the style of football he wants to play and the track record up to this point. But yeah, I think there is marked differences between Klopp and Hasenhuttl. But they do share the same flow state, and it's about bringing players together. It's about building a culture, and it's about empowering people to do their jobs within a club, and not necessarily being, you know, the guy that has the final say on a tactical level, the logical, technical level. I don't think that's necessarily Hasenhuttl's biggest strength, which kind of surprises me now. I've done a deep dive on him because you see the associations with the Red Bull clubs and the background, and you get the German football hipsters come out and tell you this certain thing, and it's just a continuation of the same narrative usually. And it's it's kind of surprising to see that actually Hasenhuttl's not necessarily this tactical genius. He's a very keen learner about the tactical side of the game and wants to stay on top of that side, but he's not necessarily someone who brings new ideas to the table. He's just following a philosophy that he's very familiar with from his background.
Yeah, he talks about training, and that is, a really important thing for him. He talks about how him and his team, they have a guidebook. They did at Leipzig. I presume they do at Southampton as well, or something similar. It probably is computerized now, but it keeps updates of every single game and every single player. And he breaks down these stats in training and works out how to simplify it for the players and the areas in which they can improve. And also he's fairly big on the data as well, and the video technology. And he also says that video technology has allowed language barriers to be broken down as well. It's not all instructions just coming from one voice to another. It's, here's a video, I'll point to what you've done and you interpret it this way. He's very sort of welcoming of this technology, isn't he?
Yeah, and it's concrete, real-world evidence. There's no nuance to have to explain. That's why you will like the video analysis side of things. That's why you will like the statistics, because there's nothing better to get a point across. Certainly for someone of his personality type, the best way to get a point across is concrete numbers, concrete things that you can just show somebody and not have to go into lots of detail about the underlying principles of why this is the case. Or, it's the more you can make the process black and white, the easier the process becomes, the more you can build on that process over time and know that you're building on a solid foundation. So I think that's kind of why he likes these aspects of the game. He's not very mind-body focused. He's not necessarily anticipating what might be going on in his players' minds or really necessarily focused on energy. He is very keen on players that run a lot. He's made that point several times. But in terms of understanding or appreciating necessarily the technical ability of players, like what players might be capable of rather than what they're showing. It's very much about a collective and players as components within a team doing their jobs properly.
And it's interesting, actually, because he said this several times as well. Now, this was before he came to Southampton, but he admitted that, and I think this is a season when Leipzig had cup commitments, European commitments, and then obviously the league as well to concentrate on. Bear in mind that there are fewer games in the Bundesliga. He said that he felt that his hardest challenge and where he struggled was when his team didn't have time to train, when there was only 2 or 3 days between games and they were coming thick and fast. Now, last season wasn't brilliant for Southampton. Do you think that could have been a key factor to Hasenhuttl? Do you think he would relish a bit more time in between games?
Yeah, it's an interesting connection, actually, because it would make sense. I think that the congested schedule last season, for example, suited managers, almost classroom managers, who could articulate themselves and their ideas very clearly through word of mouth. But basically the spoken word could distill concepts to really understandable things. I don't think that's necessarily a strength for Hasenhuttl. He wants to, it's almost about outer world, doing things in the outer world and showing people. Again, we go back to the video analysis, but showing on the training ground as well and walking through step by steps. So if you don't get the time to do that, then it does make sense that, why this has been a difficult period for him last season. So yeah, with a less congested schedule next season, I'm guessing on that basis, you would expect an improvement again.
So one thing that Hasenhuttl talks about is keeping in touch with former players, and Pascal Gross was one of them as well. When Hasenhuttl was umming and ahhing about going to the Premier League, Gross said, "You'd love it here." And I know he said in the past he emails and he texts former players and asks how they're doing and follows their progress. So clearly on a relationship level with his players, this is more than a sort of coach-player relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, this is his flow state. He's a people person, and he's all about those connections with people and wanting to stay in touch with what everybody's up to. He's very typical of his personality type as well. The little details of people's lives. He's the sort of person that will never forget how many kids you've got, the name of your kids, those kinds of things. It really matters to him, those kinds of details, and that he feels like he understands somebody so much better when he's got that background information on them, and really, shows that he really cares about people. And I think this kind of explains quite a bit about some of his difficult periods at Southampton as well. That when it doesn't matter the people he surrounds himself with in terms of coaches, backroom staff, or technical directors or people like that, so long as they're good at the jobs, he can work with anybody. And he's had lots of different backroom staff at different times. And he just likes engaging people, delegating to people to do their best work of what they're good at. And he doesn't he tries to control the overall process and have the handle on the overall, the way things go. We talk about, the manual or whatever of the way that they play and things like that. But ultimately, he hands over responsibility well to people and delegates really well. And he has a lot of trust and faith in a lot of other people, to the point that they really want to repay that trust and faith. So I imagine that the training ground and the day-to-day experience with Hasenhuttl is, and this goes back to the point about classroom learning and quick turnarounds and not having that time on the training ground. I think the day-to-day is probably really good bonding sort of territory, that things happen on the day-to-day that just make people feel more together. Where you thrust from one game into the next, it probably feels a little bit more cold and clinical, and those relationships are kind of diluted somewhat from not having that day-to-day experience.
Yeah, it does seem to be an enjoyable experience being on the training ground with him and his staff. And as you say about the relationships, he also talks about how he wants to maintain a good relationship with the media as well. A lot of managers that we see just aren't bothered. They will harangue and berate the media. He says that he wants to be respectful. Even the guy who asked the unprofessional or irritating question, he says he will be courteous to them as well. So you imagine as well the staff around Southampton, not the playing staff, but everybody else, who works in the canteen, who cleans the toilets at the training ground. You imagine he gives that same level of respect to everybody.
Yeah, I think respect is a key word. And I think it comes back to connections again and communication. I think communication is a big thing for him, in that, a big part of being a people person is being able to communicate and wanting to communicate better. And, I think back to talking about the interview process for the Southampton job, and I think it was a hotel at Heathrow Airport that he had a meeting, and he kept apologising for his level of English, which was absolutely perfect. And he couldn't see it wasn't good enough for him. He always wants to communicate better, and the thought of not having a language totally nailed probably was something that was unsettling for him, that he didn't have the level of confidence he would have liked. So communication is a big aspect, and just understand it's important for him to know that everybody's getting his message, and that we're on the same page. Basically, is what he's trying to achieve all the time. So even when it comes to the media and reporters that might not ask nice questions or courteous questions themselves, his objective is we need to, by the end of this question, be on the same page about this topic if we can. So I've got to try and do everything I can to make that happen.
You said the word earlier on, so we very briefly touched on it, but learning is key, isn't it? Self-improvement, continuing learning along the way. We talked about Carlos Corberán a few weeks ago, takes every experience as a learning one. In a way, Hasenhuttl's similar. He doesn't relish it quite as much, but he speaks about how when things are not going his way, he can learn from it and develop. And even during his time off between Leipzig and Southampton, he was spotted shadowing other coaches that he previously worked with. And, he was spending his time off, not lounging by the sea, not doing a 1,000-piece jigsaw, but looking at other coaches and working out how he can improve.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting point about this as well. You mentioned Carlos Corberán there, and Corberán's type of learning is to go out in the outer world and get as many experiences as possible, go out collecting experience from real far-flung places. Hasenhuttl, he goes inside to learn. He needs privacy, he needs quiet time, he needs isolation in order to absorb new information. And this is why we talk about him, he goes incognito when he goes on these missions to watch teams train. He doesn't let the manager know he's going to watch them. He's almost like in the bushes with binoculars watching, because he says, when you turn up and you're invited to somebody's training ground, everybody comes up and wants a chat and everybody wants a conversation. Now, Ralph Hasenhuttl cannot turn down those conversations. It's a flow state for him to have this engaging conversation and have this face time with people. But if he's doing that, he's not learning, because he's not paying close attention to what's actually going on. That's not the connection piece. So he'd much rather be in the bushes or be outside the training ground looking on with his binoculars, really trying to absorb what's going on visually, concrete information again. And then what he will do is he will go away and he will post-process it. So the biggest ideas and the biggest takes that he'll have from these learning sessions will come to him later. He won't necessarily cotton on in the moment that this is what they're doing right now and this is why they're doing it. Slowly but surely over time, things will dawn on him that it's almost like he captures the information in the moment, but then he goes away and reviews it. And it's almost like working your way through that information twice. So it's really steadily going through and understanding, having a real concrete understanding of what it is that you've learned. So every learning experience is something to build on time after time after time. You never forget what you learn, because you go through such a deep process in order to understand that information and make sense of it, that then it's a solid building block moving forwards.
I don't know if he's done this with Southampton. I certainly haven't seen it yet, but he may well have done. He certainly did it at Leipzig a couple of times. He says he really enjoys watching from the stands, because you can see how his team are playing from a fan perspective and from an opposition perspective as well.
Yeah, I'm guessing this ties to it a little bit then. It's the isolation factor of, not sitting on your own might be the big thing about it, and not being around the other voices on the bench. That might be a big part of it, is that you can just go into your own little world and you can see the bigger picture. And, we all understand that if you're watching from the stands, you get a different perspective. But I also think that it possibly enables him at key moments to go into his own mind and not be constantly, in the realm of feedback. So he can get some sort of sense of clarity on his own thoughts, and check that the thoughts he's having are not thoughts that somebody else has passed on to him, that there's biases in there, that this is genuinely what I believe myself, because I've come to this conclusion purely on my own.
And away from football, there's an arty side to him as well. He plays the piano. He was brought up in a very musical household. This is a manager who somehow finds time to enjoy culture also.
Yeah, I think this is possibly, this is revealing something about his personality, but not necessarily about his management style, because this is, I think, a more playful state. And I think what it does show is the fact that he's found these things in his life means that he's switching off properly. So, some managers don't necessarily have the switch off time that they should have. I think if he's engaging in these pursuits outside of football, this suggests this is a man that's recharging well, and coming back fresh each time, because I don't think there's necessarily connections there. This is more of a playful state. This is something that he does in his own time. So that would be my take from that, is that, he is recharging properly when he's engaging in those activities.
And it feels like, in terms of the recharge, as you say, some managers probably just don't ever do that, don't ever switch off until they're sacked. And even then they go straight into media and whatnot. But he has talked before about the physical exertions that came with managing Leipzig and the Bundesliga and hectic fixtures, which you mentioned earlier in the podcast. He clearly knows when he needs time. He clearly understands that you can't go on like this forever. He seems quite self-aware in terms of what his body and his mind are telling him.
Yeah, well, he is naturally inclined to throw himself into things. I think his energy levels are high day to day. So again, it kind of shows. I guess this is through learning. I guess this is through possibly understanding that those times when you do isolate yourself and you go through your learning experiences, some of my best insights have probably come from those moments. So I need to, it's just making those connections over time. Sometimes the time you spend away from the game can be the most valuable in terms of understanding that you do your best work when you return, as opposed to when it's just a continuous stream of non-stop work. So yeah, this is real world experience again. This is from personal experience and from over the years of, the time that he's been in the game.
The final question then on Hasenhuttl and Southampton is, we touched upon some of the reasons why last season may have been a bit of a write-off. They start again, they go fresh. They're a stable Premier League team. They've got a very good squad. What do you see happening next season? And do you see Hasenhuttl being there long term?
Well, he's been there quite a while now, and he has weathered these 2 9-0 defeats, which, could derail some managers in some jobs. And I think he's a good fit for them in the sense that, or certainly Southampton's a good fit for him, because I think he's, as a provincial club that doesn't necessarily have, it's a big club, but it doesn't have big city pressures that, of being two teams in the same city or anything like that. And it's kind of off the national radar. And I think this kind of suits Hasenhuttl, because I think deep down he's a humble man and a humble manager who just enjoys the simple pleasures in life. And it's a nice part of the world. And like you say, but you then get to, on a Saturday, be part of this big league in the Premier League. So I think the club suits him. But obviously, last season got a little bit concerning towards the end. So there needs to be a little bit of a revival now, I would expect, in the coming season. And just the longer turnaround time should suit him. So I think Southampton are a fairly comfortable Premier League club. So long as they don't return in the way that they were in the second half of last season. There was a long strings of defeats in that second half of the season when the congested schedule, should we say, was getting to them. Then you would expect, they're kind of in that third quarter of the Premier League, I think, is generally where they belong. So as long as they keep hitting it, I don't think anyone expects Southampton to be in the top half of the table, but they do set standards from time to time that threaten, that they have their little patches in a season where they're talked about, the data's good, the results are good, they're perfectly capable of beating top teams in the league. I think that's one thing we can say about Hasenhuttl. He's beaten Liverpool, he's beaten Manchester City, he's beaten all the top managers and the top teams at different points. So more of the same. I think if they just keep going along those lines, I see no reason why Southampton would want to change manager. They seem a club that's happy in its own skin, so long as they're keeping relegation at arm's length.
I've fallen into my own trap again there, saying last question and then thinking of something else to ask you. But this genuinely is the last question on Ralph Hasenhuttl. Is Southampton his limit? Or, we talk about him being happy in his own skin and, enjoying the simple pleasures in life. Would he want the pressure of managing a bigger club than Southampton in the Premier League?
I don't think so, no. My suspicion is no, that he is happy. Managers get put on the spot sometimes and get given a job offer that they weren't expecting. And then all of a sudden it becomes about, have you got the bottle for it and stuff like this. I think genuinely deep down, Hasenhuttl's happy. He's up to the level of doing what he's been doing with Southampton so far. That's not to say that if the big opportunity came along, he wouldn't take it. But I don't think he's in a rush to take jobs like that. I don't think he's somebody. We talk about some managers who think they can go out and change the world and they can be the number one coach in the world. I don't think Hasenhuttl's like that at all. I think he wants to learn and get better. He wants to understand his craft and be the best he possibly can be at his craft. But I don't think he gets carried away about himself. So maybe, it's an ego thing. There's not much ego there. It is just so long as he's in a happy environment and surrounded by people that he enjoys working with and he can do good work and he can keep developing at his own rate, then so long as the environment's right, he's happy to stay in that environment. So I think, as far as the Premier League goes, I can't really imagine Ralph Hasenhuttl at a different club.